Let's start not with the news itself, but with a question about how you should read the news. Every week you get a flood of claims. A city has fallen. A summit has produced a communique. A poll shows this or that percentage of a population wants peace. Almost none of that flood tells you what is actually happening in the corridors of power. It tells you what various interested parties want you to believe is happening. So before we get into Konstantinovka, before we get into the drone war, before we get into the argument in Europe about rearmament, I want to set up the frame we are going to use, which is simple. Don't ask what happened. Ask who benefits from this version of events being believed, and what does the timing tell you about the incentive structure underneath it. Keep that in your head, because almost every story this week rewards that kind of reading. When you filter for the signal rather than the noise, the geopolitical chess game between the United States, China, Russia, and the broader Middle East becomes clear, revealing a highly calculated landscape where rhetoric is a currency and strategic patience is the ultimate weapon. The mainstream media functions as a magnifying glass for tactical events, but it consistently fails to provide the wide-angle lens necessary to view the grand strategy of major powers. Start with Konstantinovka. The Russian Ministry of Defense, through General Gerasimov, has told President Putin that the city, a pre-war population of roughly 80,000, historically a glass manufacturing center in the Donetsk industrial belt, is now under Russian control. Putin received this in a televised, clearly staged setting, and Russian channels released footage of soldiers raising flags across multiple districts of the city, including in its northeastern neighborhoods. Ukrainian officials have not confirmed full loss of the city, and independent verification of urban combat zones is notoriously difficult. You are relying in practice on drone footage, geolocated social media clips, and competing official statements. What we can say with more confidence is structural. This is a city that sits inside the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk fortified line, the last major Ukrainian-held urban cluster in Donetsk Oblast. And if it has in fact fallen, or is close enough to have fallen, that the distinction no longer matters operationally, that changes the shape of the whole front. Because a fortified line is not a series of independent strong points, it is a system. And systems fail differently than they hold. When one major node of a fortified network goes, the defensive value of the neighboring nodes drops faster than their individual strength would suggest, because supply lines, artillery coverage, and reserve rotation all run through the network as a whole. To fully grasp the magnitude of this tactical shift, one must understand that the industrial belt of the Donbass was engineered over decades, first under Soviet industrial planning, and later through intense military fortification, to act as an impregnable barrier. It was designed to absorb immense kinetic pressure while allowing defending forces to inflict maximum attrition on an advancing adversary. When a system of this nature begins to fracture, the operational calculus changes for both sides. The attacker no longer faces a continuous wall, but a series of isolated pockets, while the defender is forced to make agonizing choices about whether to hold compromised positions or retreat into open terrain where they are far more vulnerable to long-range fire systems. Mainstream reporting tends to treat the loss of a city as a simple subtraction of territory, but a strategic analyst views it as a systemic de-alignment of logistics. The roads and rail junctions running through Konstantinovka do not merely serve that town. They feed the entire sector. Without them, the energy required to sustain a modern military apparatus increases exponentially, creating a compounding deficit that cannot be easily remedied by incoming Western aid. Now, here's the interesting part, the part that a headline-driven read would miss entirely: the timing. This announcement landed the day before a NATO summit in Ankara, one that Donald Trump was set to attend. That is not a coincidence, nor does it require a conspiracy theory to explain. It is a very ordinary piece of information war logic. If you are Moscow and you believe you have a battlefield fact that undercuts the Western narrative of Ukrainian resilience, you release it at the moment of maximum attention, right before the alliance sits down to debate exactly how much more money and material to commit. You are not just reporting a military fact. You are trying to shape the cost-benefit calculation of the people in that room. It forces the leadership inside that summit room to confront a stark divergence between the optimistic briefings prepared by their intelligence staffs and the cold, unyielding reality on the ground. This timing is designed to widen the existing political fractures within the alliance, offering ammunition to those factions advocating for a reduction in long-term commitments and casting a shadow of futility over the entire proceedings. Which brings me to something Putin said in the same meeting that I think is more consequential than the city itself. He described the ground Russian forces are currently seizing inside Kharkiv and Sumy oblasts, Ukrainian territory under any current legal or diplomatic framework, including Russia's own prior negotiating positions, as in his words, historically Russian. I want to be precise about what that is and isn't. It is not a territorial fact. Ukraine's borders inside Kharkiv and Sumy are not seriously disputed in international law, and even the Kremlin has up to this point generally described its operations there as creating a security buffer zone rather than annexing territory. What Putin's comment actually is a signal, the kind of signal that matters enormously in bargaining theory. When a party expands its rhetorical claim beyond its stated operational objective, that tells you something about where its reservation price is moving. If the buffer zone justification was ever a real ceiling on Russian ambitions in the Northeast, this kind of language suggests the ceiling is drifting upward. And once a leader has said publicly that ground his own country still legally recognizes as Ukrainian is historically his, walking that back later gets expensive. Domestically, this becomes a commitment device. It is much harder to trade away land you've told your own population was always yours. This linguistic escalation effectively burns the diplomatic bridges behind the regime, signaling to Washington and its allies that the price of peace has just gone up and that prior compromises are no longer on the table. General Nikiforov, who commands the northern grouping of Russian forces, gave Putin an update that fits this same pattern. Steady territorial expansion of the buffer zone, forces reportedly within a matter of kilometers of Sumy city itself. And this is the detail worth sitting with, an admission that countering Ukrainian long-range drone strikes launched from inside that same northeastern region has been harder than expected. If that's true, it gives you a coherent, non-conspiratorial explanation for why Russian operations in that corner of the map keep expanding even when the stated justification is purely defensive. The deep strike threat against Russian territory and against Moscow specifically is assessed, rightly or wrongly, as originating from launch sites inside that strip of Ukraine. Whether or not you find that justification convincing, it is internally consistent and it tells you the Northeastern Front is not a side theater. It may be where the next several months of this war are actually decided. The military necessity of suppressing these launch sites overrides the diplomatic desire to keep the conflict contained, dragging more territory into the active combat zone and further complicating any future attempts to establish a stable demarcation line between the warring parties. Let's move to the question everyone in the West keeps asking without asking it properly. Does Ukraine want to negotiate? There's a poll circulating, provenance uncertain, methodology not independently verified, so treat the number itself with real caution, claiming that around 2/3 of Ukrainians want negotiations to start. Even if that number is roughly right, it tells you almost nothing on its own, because negotiate is not a policy position, it's a direction. The actual policy question is what you're willing to trade. And on that question, Ukrainian public opinion is very likely fractured in ways a single top-line number can't show you. Are people willing to formally cede Donetsk and Luhansk? Are they willing to accept permanent neutrality instead of NATO membership? Are they willing to give up the demand for reparations and war crimes prosecutions as a precondition for talks? Those are 4 separate questions with 4 separate distributions of answers. And collapsing them into 66% want peace is exactly the kind of simplification that headline culture rewards and that actual analysis should resist. Public opinion in a state undergoing existential conflict is never a monolith. It is a volatile mix of exhaustion, defiance, and internal political rivalry. A citizen may deeply desire an end to the destruction while simultaneously viewing any territorial compromise as an act of treason, creating a psychological deadlock that prevents the political leadership from executing a pivot toward diplomacy. Here's the structural bind Zelensky is in, and it's worth understanding as a bind rather than as a personal failing, because it explains behavior that otherwise looks contradictory. Back in 2022, he signed a decree formally prohibiting Ukrainian negotiations with the current Russian government. He later carved out a personal exemption so he alone could negotiate if he chose to. And under pressure, mostly from Washington, Ukrainian delegations did in fact sit down with Russian counterparts multiple times through 2025 in Istanbul, Abu Dhabi, and Geneva. None of it produced anything. And by the end of last year, he'd shifted to saying there was no point continuing without an unconditional ceasefire on the current lines first. Look at what that demand actually requires, though. It asks Russia to freeze in place while giving up any further territorial or negotiating leverage before substantive talks even begin. And it does this at precisely the moment Russian forces are advancing, not retreating. From a game theoretic standpoint, that is not a serious opening position for an actor who currently holds the weaker hand on the battlefield. It's a position that only makes sense if you either believe the battlefield trend is about to reverse, or if the primary audience for the demand is not Moscow at all, but domestic and Western public opinion. I'd suggest it's mostly the latter, which is itself useful information about where the real decision-making constraint sits. Not can Ukraine get a good deal, but can Ukraine's government survive being seen to accept a bad one? To sign a decree ceding land after years of immense societal sacrifice is to invite an immediate domestic political crisis, one that could destabilize the state from within far more effectively than foreign artillery. That's the mirror image, by the way, of the constraint on Putin's side. He now has less room to accept a settlement that gives up recently claimed ground than he did a year ago, because leaders very rarely lose power for continuing a war their public still tolerates and the state security apparatus remains loyal. But they can lose it fast for appearing to surrender gains their own propaganda told the country were already secured and historical. Both leaders, in other words, may currently be more constrained by their own prior rhetoric than by the actual balance of forces. That's a very old pattern in the history of wars that outlasts their original strategic logic. The fighting continues partly because stopping has become more politically dangerous for both leaderships than continuing, independent of what continuing actually achieves militarily. It is a classic manifestation of the dollar auction dilemma in international relations, where both parties have invested so much capital, prestige, and blood into the contest that they feel compelled to keep bidding, even when the prize itself no longer justifies the compounding cost of the auction. Now let's talk about how this gets reported, because the coverage gap itself is data. Konstantinovka's reported fall received essentially no coverage in major British outlets in the days after the announcement. BBC coverage was minimal to absent, and Reuters' report bundled the Russian claim with the now standard framing that Ukraine has been retaking the battlefield initiative and inflicting disproportionate Ukrainian favorable losses. That's not necessarily dishonest reporting. It may just be institutional inertia, the tendency of any large organization, media included, to keep repeating the frame that has organized its previous 6 months of coverage, rather than update sharply on a single data point. But it has a real-world effect regardless of the reason. It means Western publics, and by extension Western governments, who are ultimately accountable to those publics, are working with a systematically lagged picture of the battlefield. And if the people making funding and strategy decisions are working from a lagged picture, the decisions themselves lag reality, which tends to make the eventual correction more disruptive than a series of smaller adjustments would have been. It creates a dangerous disconnect where strategy is decoupled from physical capability, leading to overextension and eventual strategic surprise. Let's shift to the drone war, because it's a genuinely interesting case study in how quickly an asymmetric tactic can be countered once the other side takes it seriously. Ukraine has continued large-scale drone and missile strikes into Russian territory. Reports put one recent combined attack at roughly 400 drones plus Flamingo cruise missiles targeting the Votkinsk plant that produces Iskander ballistic missile components, along with a strike attempt on St. Petersburg, reportedly launched from vessels in the Gulf of Finland. By most available accounts, this particular wave was largely intercepted or missed its targets. No confirmed damage at Votkinsk, a modest fire at one refinery tank near St. Petersburg, and some disruption in Belgorod, which as a frontline city absorbs strikes fairly routinely, regardless of any broader trend. The headlines focused on the dramatic footage of a single drone striking a high-rise in the past, but they completely ignored the hundreds that are brought down silently by electronic jamming long before they reach their targets. Compare that to the much more famous deep strike on Moscow earlier in the year, when a small fraction of a much larger drone wave, reportedly as few as 7 out of several hundred, got through and produced the dramatic footage that circulated worldwide. The gap between those two outcomes is the story. It suggests the Moscow strike may have been less a demonstration of a durable new capability than a one-time exploitation of a specific gap in air defense coverage. A gap that has likely since been closed through reorganized Air Defense Command, wider distribution of counter-drone equipment to industrial sites, And on the front line specifically, new anti-drone ammunition and dedicated radar sets push down to infantry units. None of this means Ukrainian drone capability is finished as a strategic tool. It means the offense-defense balance in this specific technological contest is shifting the way it always eventually does when one side treats a new threat as an emergency rather than a curiosity. That's worth remembering anytime you see a single spectacular strike treated as proof of a permanent shift in the war. A lot of military history is made of temporary windows that get closed within a season. This represents the eternal pendulum of military history, swinging between the dominance of the offensive and the defensive, reminding us that no single technological innovation remains uncountered for long in a conflict between two industrialized adaptive systems. Now, to Europe and to what I think is genuinely the most underreported story in the whole set, more than any single battlefield claim, nobody in European policy circles appears to have actually modeled what the current rearmament wave does to the European economy. A recent analysis circulating from a transnational policy research group makes a claim that, if accurate, is remarkable. That across the major national defense and economic research institutes in Scandinavia, Germany, France, the Netherlands, the UK, Italy, and Poland, along with the EU's own institutions, not one has published a systematic comparison of the economic multiplier of military spending against civilian spending. These institutions produce plenty of work: threat assessments, industrial capability roadmaps, procurement compliance reviews. What's absent is the much more basic economic question. Does a euro spent on artillery shells generate more or less employment, consumption, and long-term productivity than a euro spent on infrastructure, healthcare, or civilian manufacturing? That's not an exotic academic question. It's the first thing you'd want answered before committing hundreds of billions of euros in a policy direction. And by this account, it simply hasn't been asked, at least not publicly. I'd apply the same who benefits. What does the silence tell you frame here that we used on the battlefield claims? A genuine, rigorous multiplier study might come back favorable to rearmament. Defense spending isn't intrinsically inferior economically. That's a real empirical question, not a foregone conclusion in either direction. But the near total absence of anyone even attempting the study across dozens of well-funded institutions that study everything else about defense policy in exhaustive detail is itself informative. Institutions tend to avoid producing evidence that could complicate a political consensus their funders have already committed to. That's not a uniquely European failing, and it's not new. It's the same pattern that showed up when the initial wave of sanctions against Russia was decided by what appears from the available reporting to have been a fairly narrow group of officials, without the kind of broad consultation of people with direct experience of the Russian and European energy economies that a decision of that scale would normally call for. The predictable result, a push toward European deindustrialization as gas flows were cut, was flagged by independent commentators at the time and is now broadly accepted as having happened. The lesson isn't sanctions were wrong as a blanket judgment. It's that decisions made by small insulated groups tend to underweight the costs that fall outside that group's immediate field of vision. And that pattern looks like it may be repeating itself now with rearmament. When defense spending crowds out investments in education, innovation, and infrastructure, a state may build a larger army today at the cost of weakening the economic foundation required to sustain that army tomorrow. One more thread worth pulling, because it's a clean example of how a genuinely mundane fact can be inflated into an alarming headline through nothing more than framing. A report suggested China was providing military training to Russian forces, and it triggered a formal diplomatic protest from Berlin. Read past the headline, and the underlying fact is a publicly acknowledged, long-running joint Russian-Chinese military exercise. Nothing secret, nothing new, reportedly focused in part on procedures for operating in the aftermath of a weapons of mass destruction incident. That's worth noting for a completely different reason than the one the headline implies. It's mildly unsettling that both governments apparently feel it's worth rehearsing that scenario together, and it suggests Chinese planning in that specific area may be more developed than Russia's own, but it has essentially nothing to do with Ukraine. And the idea that Russia, with several years of live battlefield experience, needs tactical instruction from a military that hasn't fought a war in decades gets the direction of expertise backwards. If anything, the learning flow moves in the opposite direction, with Moscow providing real-world data on Western weapon performance and countermeasures to a Chinese military eager to update its own operational doctrines. The story spread anyway across multiple outlets because China is training Russia to fight Ukraine is a more emotionally legible headline than two militaries that have run joint exercises for years ran another one. That's the information environment you're operating in right now on every side of this conflict. And it's worth building the habit of asking every time a striking claim crosses your feed whether the underlying fact actually supports the framing or whether the framing did most of the work. This misreading of the Sino-Russian relationship reflects a broader failure to understand the true nature of their strategic partnership. It is not an ideological alliance built on mutual trust, but a pragmatic alignment driven by a shared structural interest in altering the Western-dominated global order. Beijing views the conflict in Europe not through the lens of European security, but as a critical variable in its larger, multi-decade competition with the United States over the hegemony of the Indo-Pacific region. By providing economic lifelines and dual-use technology to Moscow, China ensures that the United States remains structurally distracted and materially drained in a secondary theater, preventing Washington from executing a full strategic pivot to Asia. It is a masterclass in strategic patience, allowing Beijing to accumulate economic leverage over a resource-rich neighbor while remaining insulated from the direct military costs of the confrontation. So where does that leave the overall picture? On the ground, Russian forces appear to be closing out the fight for the last major fortified urban cluster in Donetsk, while simultaneously expanding operations in the northeast in a way that Putin's own language suggests may not be bounded by the buffer zone justification for much longer. On the diplomatic side, both leaderships appear more constrained by their own prior public commitments than by the underlying military balance, which is a classic recipe for a war continuing past the point where it serves either side's actual interests. In the information environment, Western coverage seems to be lagging the battlefield reality by weeks or months. Drone warfare is proving to be a much more dynamic offense-defense contest than the unstoppable new weapon framing suggested a few months ago. And in Europe, a 500 billion euro scale economic bet is being placed without, as far as anyone can find, a single rigorous study of its own costs. None of that adds up to a prediction about exactly what happens next week. What it does give you is a set of structural pressures to watch instead of headlines to chase. Whether either leadership's domestic position becomes fragile enough to force a change in negotiating posture, whether the drone versus air defense contest keeps shifting toward the defense, and whether anyone in a position of actual policy influence in Europe finally asks the economic question that right now appears to be the biggest unexamined assumption behind the entire continent's strategic direction. Those are the indicators worth tracking. The daily scoreboard of claimed advances and claimed setbacks is mostly noise sitting on top of that signal. And the sooner you learn to filter for the signal, the less any single day's headline will be able to move your read of where this is actually heading. As these systemic pressures continue to build, one must wonder, how much longer can the international system sustain a strategy built on short-term political consensus before the unexamined economic and material realities finally force a settlement?